Joining me here in the studio to talk more about this is our senior correspondent, Owen Alterman, Daniel Shek, who's a former Israeli ambassador to France, and Jeremy Saltan, a political strategist. Gentlemen, thank you so much for all joining me this morning. 16 hours left until Israelis, till that deadline expires. Tell me, can anyone do it? Can we expect anything to change in that short time frame if it hasn't already?
We can hope, right?
We definitely can.
We can pray. Yeah, it's getting a lot closer. People are starting to sweat. Of course, the actual bill to dissolve the Knesset is going to be voted on today. We have the, of course, the press conference that Victor Lieberman has called, and none of us know what he's going to say. Although, based on his Facebook post from early this morning, I think we might have an indication. But yeah, I think the majority of MKs, whether they'll say it out loud or not, are really hoping that there is a miracle and somehow we're able to prevent this third election.
And we were just talking about Lieberman there. Tell me a little bit more about what he's coming out to say this morning. Can he change anything?
Well, Sarah, Lieberman likes to hold court, and those of us who have been privileged, I guess one would say, to be at those Monday afternoon faction meetings where that small room in the lower level of the Israeli parliament and all the journalists pack in and all the cameras pack in, and then Lieberman walks up to the podium and gets to hold court. He gets to do it for one last time, as Jeremy just mentioned, 1 o'clock this afternoon local time, when he will hold court for the final time before, by all indications, the Knesset will be dissolved, the Israeli parliament will be dissolved. But you're right, Sarah, he actually previewed, or seems to preview what he seems to be about to say at 1 this afternoon in a Facebook post this morning, coming out really with a bare-fisted attack on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, taking aim at Netanyahu, saying that unlike Netanyahu, he has not sought immunity from the Israeli parliament during his own past investigations, and turning the Prime Minister's attacks against him, Lieberman, against the Prime Minister himself, saying that maybe you are actually the one who is a tool of foreign interests, not me, Avigdor Lieberman, again with the insinuations that have always surrounded Lieberman, that he's been an agent of those in Russia or other parts of the world, but again turning it back on Netanyahu, saying that maybe he is an agent of his donors and his wealthy friends abroad. Lieberman also saying that in defending himself against his own investigations, he never asked friends for money. He instead took a loan from a bank, of course, a reference to Netanyahu, who has always been very, very willing to take money, to take gifts from friends. Of course, Sarah, that is at the center of the many investigations that Netanyahu faces.
And Daniel, tell me, what can we expect the themes of, you know, let's say this 16 hours, looking very likely now, expires. We are forced to go to a third round of elections. What are the themes of this campaigning for these parties now?
Look, there's this saying attributed to the late Golda Meir that if you don't believe in miracles in Israel, you're not a realist. But I have to say that if we are down to hoping for a miracle to save us, that's really shows the collapse of Israeli politics in these last few months. And that collapse comes from the interference into normal party politics, which are complicated and ugly enough in Israel, the infiltration of the personal fate of one man, that is Benjamin Netanyahu. It's all about how is he going to defend himself from prosecution. Once it's through a law, then it's through immunity. Everything, all his political maneuvering has been around that. So your question is actually quite simple to answer. Since the issues themselves have been debated for 2 rounds of campaigns already, this third one will be who is to blame for the third election? Because we have this situation where the overwhelming majority of Israelis, all the polls show it, do not want a third election, but the politicians haven't heard them. So the question is, who will they blame?
So what are you saying? So, you know, is anything going to change if we do indeed go to a third round of elections? What's to stop it?
You know, the easy answer would be, you know, what's changed? You know, we had the first election, there was no decisive result. The second election, no decisive result. The third one will probably not be overwhelmingly decisive either, but it could. You know, there's a poll from yesterday that shows that at this point, Benny Gantz could theoretically have a 60 seat coalition without Lieberman.
That's just one poll.
Yeah, clear. I put all the
threshold.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stars and asterisks.
A lot of stars. I completely agree. But I think that if you believe in trends, and I think politics have trends, in the first election, between the first and the second election, Netanyahu lost votes and Benny Gantz gained votes. And I believe that that trend could continue to a point where a blue-white party, a strengthened blue-white, would be able to form a coalition.
Are people going to come out and vote if we do indeed go to a third round of elections? People are pretty sick of it by now. 3 times in 1 year, massive disruption. Here in Israel, what can we expect if we do go to the third round? What can we expect the voter turnout to be like?
Right now, the polls are saying that it's about 60%, so that would be a drop of about 9%. But the campaign hasn't started. Either the campaigns will make people feel more enthusiastic and they'll go out and vote, or you could have the opposite effect. Right. What I do think usually does happen, you usually do see scare tactics by the 2 large parties at the end of the campaign, that you probably will have a situation where we will have more or less the same amount of turnout. We talked about this in the second round. The second round, more people turned out than the first round. Theoretically, we could have a
one demographic group, and that is the Arab voters, who contributed a lot to the rise in...
But not only.
No, not only.
For sure, there was a 3-seat gain because of an increase within their population.
Yeah.
For sure, within 120 seats, though.
Exactly.
It's all relative. But we're also looking at a situation where most likely a lot of the seats that were lost for the right, the 85,000 votes of Otzma, the 15,000 votes of Tzomet, we'd probably see a different alignment of the right-wing parties to the right of the Likud, and that could also mean for Netanyahu additional right-wing's additional seats for his right-wing bloc.
You know, and what's interesting is connecting the 2 questions, Sarah, your question about whether the third election's result could be different from the first 2 and the question of turnout. Of course, if in fact turnout is 60%, that undoubtedly would help Benjamin Netanyahu because, of course, the drop in those 9% would not come from each group in the same proportion, and one would expect ultra-Orthodox voters, for example, to continue to come out by the same margin, potentially Arab voters in a much lower margin. That would seem to help Netanyahu.
And Owen, tell me, on an international scale, how is this political turmoil looking? You know, if you're outside Israel looking in, what does it look like for Israel?
Well, I think, Sarah, there are 2 answers. One is, of course, befuddlement, the same kind of befuddlement and confusion abroad that there frankly is here in Israel about how this could be happening. Obviously, this is unprecedented here, so just as people here are confused and befuddled, so are people in other parts of the world. The second answer, I think, is more complicated. And by the way, this is, in some sense, the answer that's being given, for example, by experts at the Israel Democracy Institute here in Israel, which is that there are plenty of other democracies that have their own political quagmires. Not necessarily a third set of elections as we have here in Israel, although Spain has come very close to that. Seems like they'll be able to avoid it. But there are other countries that have their own difficult and intractable politics. Of course, the British heading for their own election tomorrow. They're still struggling with the Brexit process. Other countries in Europe struggling with their own political stalemates. Of course, in places like Belgium and the Netherlands, there are caretaker governments that govern not only for months, Sarah, but for years, because they don't have the same kind of deadlines we have here in Israel for forming governments. So on the one hand, I think there's the same kind of confusion and befuddlement. But on the other hand, I think there's a sense that Israel's not necessarily alone, even if our situation is unique, that no other country has had 3 elections in the same span of time, at least in recent memory. But each country in its own way it's stuck in its own political quagmire.
Daniel, you look like you had something to say there.
You know, I've learned over time that 9 times out of 10, when you ask, what are they thinking about me, the answer is they're not. They're simply not interested. I follow quite a lot of French and European media. It's a tiny little, they're not interested. It's too complicated, it's too boring, it's too repetitive. They will cover it, of course, when there is the election and if there are some highlights in the campaign. But basically, and I agree with Owen, I mean, there's so many forms of political complications around the world today that we're not that special. So I think that just, you know, some people say gladly or sadly, they're not so much interested in what's going on here as they were in the past.
All right. Daniel, Owen and Jeremy, really appreciate you all coming in, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this for a little bit longer now. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Sarah.
83 days to go.
Oh, exciting.